In the heady, victorious autumn of 1944, the Allied armies were sweeping across France and Belgium with an unstoppable momentum that intoxicated the High Command with the belief that the Third Reich was on the verge of total collapse, a sentiment that led generals and privates alike to believe they would be home by Christmas. The U.S. First Army, under the command of Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, had raced from the hedgerows of Normandy to the very doorstep of Germany in record time, leaving a trail of broken Wehrmacht divisions in its wake. And as they gazed upon the dragon's teeth of the Siegfried Line, the mood was one of aggressive impatience. However, directly in the path of the 7th Corps lay a dark, dense patch of geography that looked relatively insignificant on the operational maps spread out in the comfortable chateaux of the rear echelon, a 50-square-mile triangle of woodland south of Aachen, known as the Hürtgen Forest. To General Hodges and his staff, this forest was merely a tactical annoyance, a mopping-up sector that needed to be cleared to protect the right flank of the main drive toward the Rhine River and the industrial heartland of the Ruhr. They viewed the Hürtgen through the lens of traditional maneuver warfare, assuming that the sheer weight of American firepower, the thousands of Sherman tanks, the endless artillery batteries, and the undisputed supremacy of the U.S. Army Air Forces would simply bulldoze through the trees just as they had bulldozed through the French countryside. This assumption was the first and most fatal error of the campaign, a catastrophic failure of intelligence and imagination that would doom 30,000 American soldiers to a green hell. The generals failed to realize that the Hürtgen was not a park. It was a primordial fortress, a dense monoculture of fir and pine trees, planted so closely together that a man could barely squeeze between the trunks, creating a perpetual twilight where the sun never fully touched the forest floor. The ground itself was a tortured landscape of steep ridges, deep ravines, and fast-flowing streams that negated every technological advantage the American military possessed. When the men of the U.S. 9th Infantry Division, the Old Reliables, first stepped into the tree line in mid-September, they effectively walked out of the 20th century and into a medieval nightmare, where the tank, the airplane, and the radio were rendered useless. The forest canopy was so thick that it swallowed the light, making it impossible for the Piper Cub spotter planes to identify targets for the artillery, meaning the king of battle was blind. The tactical air support, the terrifying P-47 Thunderbolts that had terrorized the Germans in France, could see nothing but a sea of green treetops, unable to distinguish friend from foe. On the ground, the situation was even worse for the armor. The few logging trails that existed were narrow, muddy tracks that wound precariously along the edges of cliffs, turning any tank that attempted to traverse them into a sitting duck for German anti-tank mines and Panzerfaust teams hidden in the brush. The moment the Americans entered the woods, they lost their mobility, the one attribute that had allowed them to win the war thus far. They were forced to fight a war of attrition on foot, yard by muddy yard, against an enemy that had spent months preparing for this exact moment. The German defenders, unlike the disorganized mobs fleeing across France, were digging in on their own soil, driven by a desperate resolve to protect the Heimat. They had integrated the forest into the Siegfried Line, building concrete bunkers disguised as log cabins, sowing hundreds of thousands of shoe mines, wooden boxes filled with explosives that were undetectable by metal detectors, and sighting their machine guns along the fire breaks. General Hodges, directing the battle from kilometers away, continued to push divisions into the wood chipper, obsessed with the lines on his map rather than the reality of the terrain, ignoring the reports from the front that described a vertical wall of wood and earth that was impenetrable. He failed to see that the forest had no strategic value in itself. The true prize was the Ruhr river dams beyond it, which could flood the Allied advance, but instead of bypassing the forest or focusing on the dams, the command decided to fight through the forest, a decision that defied tactical logic. As the first autumn rains began to fall, turning the forest floor into a freezing quagmire of gray mud. The soldiers of the 9th Division realized with a sinking dread that they were not there to liberate a town or seize a bridge. They were there simply to die in the dark. The vertical green wall had closed behind them, trapping them in a claustrophobic cage where the silence was broken only by the snap of twigs and the distant rhythmic thumping of German artillery zeroing in on their positions. The optimism of the Champagne campaign across France evaporated instantly in the damp, rotting air of the Hürtgen, replaced by the primal fear of men who knew they were being sent into a meat grinder by leaders who were fighting a war that no longer existed, on a map that lied about the contours of the earth, against an enemy who had turned nature itself into a weapon of mass destruction.
As the calendar turned to October 1944, and the relentless autumn rains began to strip the last vestiges of warmth from the air, the soldiers of the U.S. First Army discovered that the Hürtgen Forest was not merely a passive obstacle of geography, but an active participant in their destruction, a lethal ecosystem where the very trees that surrounded them were weaponized by the German defenders to create a form of artillery warfare that had not been seen since the trenches of the Somme. The defining horror of the Hürtgen, the singular phenomenon that would haunt the nightmares of every survivor for the rest of their lives, was the tree burst, a simple yet devastating adaptation of ballistics that turned the dense canopy of 70-foot-tall firs and pines into a gigantic fragmentation grenade suspended directly over the heads of the American infantry. In open country, an artillery shell strikes the ground, expending much of its lethal energy into the dirt and creating a crater that offers cover. However, in the Hürtgen, the German artillery commanders, who had pre-registered every ravine, trail, and clearing with mathematical precision long before the first GI arrived, set the fuses of their 88mm, 105mm, and 150mm shells to detonate on contact with the treetops, or used timed fuses to trigger air bursts at roof level. The result was a downward projecting cone of annihilation that defied the standard laws of survival. For when a shell exploded 50 feet in the air, it did not just spray razor-sharp, jagged steel shrapnel into the foxholes below. It shattered the massive trees themselves, sending thousands of spear-like wooden splinters, some the size of needles, others the size of baseball bats, raining down at supersonic speeds. These wooden missiles were often more hideous than the metal ones, for they were dirty, coated in resin and bark that caused immediate septic infections in the wounds they created, and they struck with enough force to pin a man to the earth or sever a limb. The American soldier, trained to hit the dirt and dig in for protection, found that his standard open-top foxhole had become a grave. The earth could protect him from the sides, but against the death raining from the canopy, he was naked. Desperate men began to cover their holes with heavy logs and sod, creating dark, claustrophobic burrows where they lay shivering in the freezing mud, listening to the terrifying, cracking thunder of the barrage tearing the forest apart above them, knowing that a direct hit on the tree above would send the logs of their roof crashing down to crush them. The psychological toll of this constant vertical bombardment was catastrophic, producing rates of combat exhaustion, then called combat fatigue, that exceeded any other battle in the European theater, as entire companies were whittled down not by enemy riflemen they could see, but by an invisible mechanized fury that stripped them of their agency and reduced them to trembling animals waiting for the mathematical probability of a shell fragment to find them. The German defense was anchored not just by artillery, but by the sinister invisibility of the Siegfried Line, a belt of fortifications that wound through the forest like a concrete serpent, comprised of pillboxes that were so perfectly camouflaged with moss, dirt, and planted saplings that an American patrol could walk within 5 yards of one without seeing it until the machine gun slit opened and cut them down from behind. These were not the hasty field works of Normandy. These were reinforced concrete monsters with walls 3 feet thick, impervious to bazooka fire and small arms, interlocking their fields of fire so that to attack one pillbox was to expose oneself to the fire of 2 others. The forest floor itself was a minefield of bouncing Bettys,
S-mines that, when triggered by a tripwire hidden in the rotting leaves, would spring into the air to waist height before detonating, filling the groin and stomach of the victim with hundreds of steel ball bearings, a weapon designed specifically to maim and demoralize. The sounds of the forest became a symphony of terror, the sharp whip-crack of the high-velocity 88mm guns, the terrifying, mournful wail of the Nabalwerfer rockets, dubbed screaming meanies by the GIs as they arced through the gray mist, and the constant wet thud of bodies falling into the mud. Visibility was often reduced to less than 20 yards by the perpetual gloom and the smoke of burning cordite that hung in the stagnant, damp air, creating a sense of isolation where a squad could be wiped out without the squad next to them even knowing a firefight was taking place. The advantages of the American military, mobility, air power, and communication were nullified by the trees. Radios failed to transmit through the dense timber and mineral-rich hills, leaving units cut off from command, while the tanks that tried to support the infantry found themselves restricted to the narrow fire breaks, where they were picked off one by German assault guns lying in ambush. The generals in the rear, staring at their maps, could not understand why the lines were not moving, why a division of 15,000 men could not advance 1,000 yards in a week, failing to grasp that inside the green hell, the war had devolved into a primal struggle where progress was not measured in miles, but in the survival of a single day under the canopy of death. Casualties mounted at a rate that stunned the field surgeons. The aid stations were overwhelmed with men whose bodies had been flayed by wood and steel, and the stretcher bearers, slipping and falling on the steep, slick hillsides, often became casualties themselves as the Germans shelled the supply routes mercilessly. By the end of October, the Hürtgen Forest had ceased to be a military objective and had become a voracious organism that consumed battalions whole, a place where the fresh reinforcements sent to the front often lasted less than 48 hours before being killed, wounded, or broken by the sheer, unmitigated horror of the tree bursts.
In the freezing, mist-shrouded dawn of early November 1944, the battered and exhausted 9th Infantry Division was finally pulled out of the line, their ranks decimated by the tree bursts and the mud, and replaced by the Pennsylvania National Guard's 28th Infantry Division, a unit whose red keystone shoulder patch would soon earn the horrific nickname the Bloody Bucket in the ravine that awaited them. Major General Norman Dutch Coda, a hero of Omaha Beach known for his aggressive leadership, was given a mission that seemed deceptively simple on the high command maps: seize the town of Schmidt, a strategic crossroads located on high ground across the deep forested gorge of the Kahl River. To the planners at Corps headquarters, Schmidt was just another town on the road to the Rhine, but they had fatally neglected the topography that separated the American jumping-off point at Wassenach from the objective, for between the two lay the Kahl Valley, a steep V-shaped canyon plunging hundreds of feet down to a freezing river and rising just as sharply on the other side, connected only by a solitary winding goat path known as the Kahl Trail. This narrow, muddy cart track, barely wide enough for a jeep and crumbling into the abyss on one side, would become the funnel of death for an entire division. On November 2nd, the attack began with deceptive success as the 112th Infantry Regiment fought their way across the valley and seized Schmidt, catching the Germans off guard. But the victory was a mirage that masked the impending logistical catastrophe. As night fell and the temperature plummeted, the Americans attempted to push their armor support, the Sherman tanks of the 707th Tank Battalion, down the precipitous Kahl Trail to reinforce the infantry holding the town, a maneuver that quickly turned into a slow-motion mechanical nightmare. The trail, slick with freezing rain and unstable mud, could not support the weight of the 30-ton steel beasts as the lead tanks tried to navigate the hairpin turns in the pitch blackness. The soft shoulder of the trail gave way, sending tanks sliding precariously toward the drop-off or throwing their tracks on the jagged rocks, effectively corking the bottle and trapping the entire supply column behind them. Engineers worked frantically in the dark, blasting rock and winching vehicles, but the trail remained a clogged artery of metal and cursing men,
while across the valley, the Germans were waking up. The German 116th Panzer Division, the Greyhounds, realized instantly that the Americans in Schmidt were isolated, their umbilical cord to the rear severed by the geography of the gorge. With the ruthless efficiency of veterans, the German commanders launched a ferocious combined arms counterattack on the morning of November 4th, unleashing tanks and infantry against the exposed American positions in Schmidt. The GIs of the 112th, lacking anti-tank mines, heavy artillery support, or their own armor, which was still hopelessly stuck miles away on the trail, fought with desperate courage, but were systematically hammered by the German panzers that roamed the streets of the town with impunity. The order to withdraw was given, but retreat in the Hürtgen was a relative term. The soldiers fled back toward the village of Kammerscheid and the lip of the Kahl Valley, only to find themselves pinned down in open fields under a relentless barrage of mortar and artillery fire that churned the mud into a soup of blood and earth. The Kahl Trail itself, the only lifeline, transformed into a linear slaughterhouse as German artillery zeroed in on the stalled column of engineers and medics. The scene in the gorge was apocalyptic. Burning jeeps illuminated the mist, casting long, dancing shadows of the dead against the canyon walls, while the screams of the wounded echoed off the rocks, unanswered because the stretcher-bearers could not move through the blockage. For days, the battle raged in this confined space, a chaotic melee where battalion commanders lost contact with their companies and generals issued orders to units that had already been annihilated. The main supply route was a muddy scar filled with the debris of a broken army, where weasel-tracked cargo carriers, the only vehicles capable of negotiating the mud, ferried ammunition forward and stacked corpses on the return trip, the dead frozen into grotesque shapes in the winter cold. General Coda, desperate to salvage the situation, personally intervened, but even his legendary bravery could not widen a dirt path or stop the rain of German shells. By the time the 28th Division was finally authorized to withdraw across the river, the Kahl Trail had become a synonym of futility, a place where the operational reach of the U.S. Army had exceeded its grasp, and where the failure to respect the terrain had cost thousands of men their lives in a battle for a town that they would ultimately have to abandon. The bloody bucket had been filled to the brim, and the survivors who stumbled back across the Kahl River Bridge were hollow-eyed ghosts, leaving behind their friends and their faith in their commanders in the dark, freezing depths of the gorge, a tragedy that remained largely unknown to the public, but was etched into the soul of every soldier who survived the massacre on the mountain trail. By late November 1944, the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest had ceased to be a conventional military engagement defined by strategy or maneuver, and had descended into a primal struggle for biological survival against an environment that seemed determined to exterminate human life through the twin tortures of hypothermia and exhaustion. As the freezing rain of autumn hardened into the biting sleet and heavy snow of the worst European winter in decades, the forest floor, already churned into a cratered wasteland by months of artillery fire, transformed into a viscous, waist-deep quagmire of gray mud that acted like a living, malevolent organism, sucking the boots off marching soldiers and swallowing vehicles whole. The infantrymen of the 4th, 8th, and 83rd Divisions, who were rotated into the line to replace the shattered regiments that had come before, found themselves living in a world of monochromatic misery where the enemy was often secondary to the elements. The foxholes, dug with agonizing slowness into the root-tangled earth, instantly filled with freezing water, forcing men to stand in an icy slurry for days on end, unable to sleep, unable to dry their socks, and unable to light fires for fear of drawing German mortar fire. The result was an epidemic of trench foot, a condition that had plagued the armies of the First World War and now returned with a vengeance to cripple the American advance. The prolonged exposure to damp cold caused the blood vessels in the feet to constrict and die, turning the flesh waxy white, then swollen red, and finally gangrenous black. Thousands of soldiers, tough men who had survived the hedgerows and the beaches, were rendered combat ineffective without ever seeing a German, carried out of the woods on stretchers because their feet had essentially rotted inside their boots. The medical aid stations were overwhelmed, not just by shrapnel wounds, but by a steady stream of shivering, blue-lipped casualties whose bodies had simply shut down. The logistics of evacuation became a nightmare of Dantean proportions. The mud was so deep and the terrain so steep that standard ambulances and jeeps were useless, bogging down within yards of the trailheads. The only vehicle capable of navigating the slush was the M29 Weasel, a small tracked amphibious carrier originally designed for snow operations, which became the lifeline of the forest. However, there were never enough weasels, and they frequently threw their tracks or struck the ubiquitous mines, leaving the wounded to be carried by hand. Teams of stretcher-bearers, 4 or 6 men to a litter, struggled for hours to move a single casualty a few hundred yards, slipping and falling in the slime, often dropping the screaming wounded into the freezing mud. Many men who might have survived their wounds on a normal battlefield died of shock and exposure in the Hürtgen, freezing to death on the stretchers before they could reach the warmth of a surgical tent. The forest began to smell of death, a sickly sweet odor of decaying flesh, cordite and pine resin that permeated the clothing and the food of the living. The psychological toll of this stalemate was absolute. The 1,000-yard stare, the blank, unfocused gaze of a mind that has retreated from reality, became the standard expression of the Hürtgen veteran. The replacement system, a flaw in the U.S. Army's organizational structure, exacerbated the tragedy. Fresh troops, teenagers drafted from the comfortable towns of America, were trucked into the line at night and thrown into foxholes with strangers, often dying before morning without ever learning the names of their squad leaders. They were meat fed into the grinder to maintain the authorized strength of units that were functionally dead. Entire companies were wiped out and reconstituted 2 or 3 times over, creating a lack of cohesion where no one knew anyone else, and the only shared bond was the terror of the tree bursts. Yet the generals in the rear, particularly General Hodges, seemed oblivious to the human disintegration occurring in the woods. They continued to order attacks against meaningless objectives, a numbered hill, a ruined logging cabin, a charred firebreak, driven by the stubborn refusal to admit that the offensive had failed. The soldiers attacked not out of patriotism or hope for victory, but out of a fatalistic automatism, walking into the machine guns because it was the only thing they knew how to do. The Germans, too, were suffering, huddled in their concrete bunkers, miserable and lice-ridden, but they possessed the advantage of defense and the shelter of the Siegfried Line. They watched the Americans coming wave after wave, marveling at the stubborn stupidity of a command that would waste its manpower in such terrain. The forest floor was littered with the detritus of the stalemate, smashed rifles, torn ponchos, unread letters from home trodden into the muck, and the frozen bodies of the fallen, which often could not be recovered for weeks, becoming stiff landmarks in the snow that the living walked past with numb indifference. By December, the Hürtgen had stripped the U.S. Army of its technological arrogance and reduced it to a primitive tribe of mud-caked survivors fighting a knife fight in a dark room, where the only prize for capturing a patch of woods was the opportunity to dig another hole in the freezing ground and wait for the next barrage to turn the trees into wooden shrapnel. The green hell had won. It had consumed the spirit of the army and left behind only mud, blood, and a pervasive, rotting decay that signaled the moral nadir of the American campaign in Europe. By early February 1945, the guns in the Hürtgen Forest finally began to fall silent, not because of a decisive tactical stroke or a brilliant maneuver, but simply because the objective had been ground into submission by the sheer weight of American blood and industrial ordnance over 5 agonizing months. Yet, as the smoke cleared, the magnitude of the strategic failure committed by the Allied High Command was laid bare in a moment of bitter, humiliating clarity. For months, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges and the First Army staff had fed division after division into the wood chipper to seize the forest, operating under the assumption that the terrain itself was the obstacle to the Rhine. However, as the battered survivors of the 78th Infantry Division finally broke through the last line of bunkers and looked down into the Ruhr Valley, the generals realized with a sickening jolt what the intelligence officers had been warning about since September. The forest was irrelevant without the dams. The Schwammenau and Erft dams, massive concrete structures sitting just upstream, held back millions of tons of water. As long as the Germans held these dams, they possessed the power to unleash a catastrophic flood that would wash away any American pontoon bridges across the Ruhr River and isolate any force that attempted to cross. The entire campaign, the sacrifice of 33,000 American soldiers, had been fought in the wrong order. The dams should have been the primary objective from day one, not the afterthought at the end. When the Americans finally launched their desperate attack to seize the Schwammenau Dam on February 9th, the German engineers simply blew the discharge valves and jammed the sluice gates open, unleashing a steady, uncontrollable torrent of water that turned the Ruhr River into a raging flood, widening it from a placid stream to a 1,000-foot-wide barrier. The American advance was halted dead in its tracks for 2 weeks, waiting for the water to recede. The soldiers who had fought through the green hell to get there could only stare at the rising water and realize that their friends had died to capture a piece of ground that was now strategically useless until the floodwaters drained. The tragedy of the Hürtgen was further compounded by the sudden eruption of the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, a massive German counteroffensive that struck just south of the forest. Cruelly, the units that bore the brunt of this new attack were the broken remnants of the divisions that had been pulled out of the Hürtgen to rest in the quiet sector of the Ardennes, specifically the 28th Division. These men, already traumatized by the tree bursts and the mud, were hammered again by the full might of the Nazi war machine, a double victimization that seemed to mock their suffering. Because of the sheer scale and drama of the Battle of the Bulge, with its clear narrative of heroism at Bastogne and Patton's race to the rescue, the grinding, static misery of the Hürtgen Forest was quietly swept under the rug of history. It was an embarrassment to the brass, a battle that offered no glory, no sweeping arrows on a map, and no clear victory to celebrate in the newsreels. It was a negative battle, a black hole that sucked in manpower and morale for zero strategic gain. The casualty figures were staggering. Over 33,000 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in the forest, with another 9,000 falling victim to trench foot and combat fatigue. To put this in perspective, the battle for the Hürtgen Forest cost more American lives than the entire Pacific campaign for the island of Tarawa. Yet while Tarawa is enshrined in Marine Corps legend, the Hürtgen remains a ghost front, largely forgotten by the American public. The generals who orchestrated this disaster, primarily Courtney Hodges, faced no official reprimand. They were allowed to finish the war and retire with their stars intact, protected by the silence of the military fraternity and the overwhelming joy of the final victory over Germany. But for the men who survived, there was no forgetting. They carried the legacy of the forest in their frostbitten feet, their scarred bodies, and their shattered nerves. They remembered the smell of the rotting pine and the sound of the wood splintering. Today, the Hürtgen Forest remains a somber place, a scar on the landscape of Europe, where the ground is still pockmarked with thousands of depressions, the remains of foxholes dug by terrified boys in 1944. Explosive ordnance disposal teams still patrol the fire breaks, finding unexploded shells and the rusted remains of rifles and helmets, artifacts of a battle that should never have been fought. The military cemeteries at Henri Chapelle and Margraten are filled with the rows of white crosses of the men who died there, a silent testament to the cost of hubris. The Battle of the Hürtgen Forest stands as a brutal history lesson on the limitations of technology against nature and the moral responsibility of command, proving that the most dangerous enemy a soldier can face is sometimes not the one holding a gun, but the one holding the map who refuses to admit he is wrong, turning a dark forest into a green graveyard for an entire generation of American youth who marched into the trees and never came back.